Hey guys, tonight we tumble into a quiet archive room where the air is stale with the scent of parchment and forgotten ambition. You reach up to a high shelf, barely lit by a flickering bulb overhead, and slide out a thin, leather-bound notebook. Its spine crackles softly as it bends open, revealing a title page inked in the hasty scrawl of someone who either didn't care for neatness or had far too many thoughts tumbling out at once. The name, Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald. Sound familiar? Of course it does. You flip past the title, past the dedication, past the scribbled out lines and editor's red markings, and then you see something odd. Not typeset prose, not a short story or a novel draft, but faint lines along the margins. Tilted handwriting almost whispered onto the paper. A different rhythm. It reads like a letter, or several. That's when you feel it. That tiny pull in your chest. This isn't just a forgotten draft. It's a time capsule for one man's heartbreak, devotion, and dangerously obsessive love. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this emotionally intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're still awake, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's oddly comforting to see just how many of us are wide-eyed at midnight, halfway across the world from each other. Now lower the lights, maybe settle into that familiar armchair, or just let the quiet fill the room. Let's ease, slowly and gently, into tonight's sleepy little tale. The paper's yellowed at the corners. Some pages feel almost brittle. You cradle them like you would cradle an old record sleeve or a letter from someone you once loved. This wasn't a public manuscript. It feels intimate, personal. Like a writer unburdening himself during insomnia hours, except instead of a diary, he uses the edges of a half-finished short story. Maybe he didn't want these read. Or maybe he wanted them discovered quietly, long after the fanfare. The first page is surprisingly undramatic. It's not the sweeping prose of Gatsby or the chaotic elegance of This Side of Paradise. No, it starts in lowercase. Was thinking of you again today, and not in the noble way. There's no address, no date, just a sentence hanging there like smoke in a still room. Historically speaking, Fitzgerald was a meticulous reviser, rewriting The Great Gatsby multiple times, agonizing over every comma. But this is raw, off guard, and possibly drunk. He famously said, "First you take a drink, then the drink takes a drink, then the drink takes you." This notebook, it seems, was composed somewhere between phase 2 and 3. You flip forward, the story that frames these notes, if you can even call it a story, is an early attempt at something that would never be published. It centers around a disillusioned young man writing a letter to a woman who's already forgotten him. Sound familiar? Fitzgerald basically wrote versions of that same man his entire career. But here, the fiction starts bleeding into fact, and the letters stop pretending to be part of any novel. They're just him. One fringe theory from a few Fitzgerald scholars suggests he used old story drafts as dumping grounds when he couldn't send actual letters to Zelda. Maybe they were fighting. Maybe she was hospitalized. Maybe he just couldn't bring himself to post them. Historians still argue whether these fragments were ever meant for public eyes, or if they were his way of exercising guilt onto paper. Either way, you've just become the accidental reader of a confession that's waited nearly a century for an audience. There's something oddly soothing about this discovery. Not the content, it's messy and sharp and raw, but the sense that even someone as celebrated, as polished as Fitzgerald, needed somewhere private to fall apart. And you, sleepy wanderer of the internet, just happened to stumble upon it at the perfect moment. Of course, that's assuming you're not dreaming already. The final line of this section reads almost like a whisper. "I left this here not for you, but for the version of me that once believed she'd come back. No capitalization, no punctuation, just breath, and then nothing, just the sound of the page turning itself back to sleep. The next time you lean in, Your eyes begin adjusting to the rhythm of his handwriting. The lines run almost diagonally, slipping down the margins like tears on a napkin. The ink's color has faded, some brown, some blue, one strangely green, but it's unmistakably the same hand. Chaotic, sharp at first, then trailing off as if the pen gave up mid-sigh. This isn't normal author annotation. These aren't edits, crossed-out similes, or rewritten sentences. These are personal. Sentences half addressed to someone who isn't you, lines curling with an intimacy that doesn't belong on the edge of a literary draft. One line reads, "You liked this phrase, remember," the one about light slipping between curtains like dancers late to a party. It doesn't make much sense without context, but it feels like something she, Zelda, might have circled in approval once, leaning over his shoulder in some smoke-filled apartment in Montparnasse. There's something almost cinematic about the moment. You picture them in Paris, 1925. She's twirling in the middle of the room, wine in one hand, cigarette in the other. He's pretending to write, but mostly just watching her. And then later, when the wine has gone warm and the music has stopped, he opens this manuscript again, not to continue the story, but to leave her a note she might never read. That's the ache in the margins. That slow realization. He was writing more to her than for us. You find another passage. "I am editing a story about a man who lies because the truth makes him small. I think that's autobiographical, darling, don't you?" The sarcasm lingers, gentle but barbed. There's real venom behind the velvet here. This wasn't a love story, not entirely. Mainstream biographies paint Fitzgerald as a romantic, tragic figure. He rose fast, flamed out young, loved passionately, and died before he saw his work canonized. But these notes, they hint at a man who was also petty, self-aware, and at times deeply cruel to himself. Historians still argue, as one particularly defensive professor once wrote, whether Fitzgerald's letters reflect vulnerability or calculated performance. You can't help but think it's both. After all, even his rawest notes are theatrically timed, like a man composing a monologue for a mirror. And yet, just as you start to harden toward him, judging his self-pity, his dramatic flair, he hits you with another line, soft and utterly unguarded. "You called me your paper prince. I laughed, but I folded." Somewhere between metaphor and confession, you realize you're not just reading history. You're inside a grief ritual disguised as literature. He wasn't trying to impress her anymore. He was trying to remember who he was when she still believed in him. There's a quirky little annotation, one that makes you smile despite the melancholy. It's wedged between two love declarations, almost like it slipped out mid-rant. "We once argued about peach jam for 30 minutes. You were wrong, obviously." It's so domestic, so beautifully pointless, that it feels more sincere than any poem he ever published. You imagine Zelda in her robe, arms crossed, accusing him of stealing the last spoonful while he swears he hasn't touched it since breakfast. It's those moments, stupid, specific, unspectacular, that make you believe these are real. Because no one fabricates arguments about jam. That kind of thing only comes from memory's back pocket. As the section ends, your eyes find a margin covered in shaky script, the ink blotched and uneven. It reads, "I wrote this story for no one, but I hope one day someone reads it anyway." You wonder if he meant the story itself or the parts written around it. The margins, the fragments, the in-between. That's what you're doing now, isn't it? Reading between, the manuscript lies quietly in your lap. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't promise answers, but it breathes slowly, like a record humming after the last song has played. And somewhere in the hush between lines, you feel it, the ghost of a man still trying to explain himself to the one person who never asked him to. You turn the page, expecting another broken margin thought, another fragment of longing scribbled in a rush. But this time the letter takes up an entire page. No story draft, no dialogue cues or prose mechanics, just a solid, uninterrupted block of text, written in slightly steadier hand, as if he sat down knowing what he needed to say. At the top, in elegant loops, "Zelda, my Zelda." It's the kind of salutation that hurts just reading it. He's not writing to "my darling" or "sweetheart." He's writing to her as if saying her name aloud anchors him. You can almost feel the quiet behind that line, as if he paused right there for a minute before continuing. The letter begins with a gentle recitation of memory, nothing fancy, just a few shared mornings in bed, the smell of ink on her fingers, the sound of her laugh ricocheting off a marble hotel bathroom. "You used to hum when you were brushing your hair," he writes. "That little nothing tune, I hear it in my spine sometimes." That's when the ache starts to creep in, not yours, his, because this isn't a love letter in the traditional sense. This is a man clawing back moments to prove they happened. He's less interested in seduction and more desperate for validation that he didn't imagine everything. "I remember you," he writes, in a yellow dress so bright it nearly erased the room. "I remember the way you said my name like it was a mischief you were barely allowed." He could be exaggerating, he often did, but something about this letter feels stripped bare. The jokes are gone, the literary ornaments set aside. You can almost hear his voice as he writes, soft, tired, afraid. Midway through, the letter shifts, the memories blur into apology. "You were not always kind," he says, "but I was worse. I made a habit of loving you more on paper than in person." That line hangs heavy, because here it is, the hidden truth of their marriage, spelled out in ink not meant for publication. Fitzgerald knew he turned Zelda into myth. Into Daisy, into Rosalind, into every glittering girl who walked into a ballroom and stole the world's attention. He trapped her in fiction, then got angry when she tried to live beyond the pages. Historians still argue whether Zelda's own writing threatened him, or whether he feared her sanity less than her talent. In this letter, though, there's no mention of novels or publication, just guilt and longing. "You used to ask if I'd ever stop using us for stories," he writes. "I told you no, I tell you no again." It's harsh, but honest, the kind of lines someone writes when they've stopped trying to look good in the retelling. And then out of nowhere, a quirky sidebar. "I found that ridiculous brooch again," he scrawls in the margin. "The one you swore looked like a squashed spider, but wore to every party anyway." It's almost funny, almost. You picture Zelda, head thrown back in laughter, daring someone to comment on her terrifying jewelry. And Scott, quietly hoping no one would, because he hated drawing attention unless he controlled the lighting. The letter ends with something simple, something heartbreakingly incomplete. "I hope this version of me is one you'd still kiss." There's no signature, no date, just that line, and beneath it, a faint smudge where a thumb might have lingered too long before turning the page. You sit in silence for a moment, not out of reverence necessarily, just the kind of quiet that comes after someone tells you something deeply human, something too flawed to be romanticized, too tender to ignore, and you realize. This isn't just a letter, it's a mirror, of a man who built cathedrals out of sentences but couldn't quite build a home inside his own heart. The page whispers as you turn it, careful not to crease the corner. You're not ready for what comes next. By now, the pages feel warmer in your hands, either from your own breath or from the quiet intensity of what you're holding. This next letter has no gentle opening, no flowery reminiscence. It launches like a match struck in a dark hallway. "We were awful to each other, weren't we?" That's it, no my Zelda, no lingering metaphors, just a hard truth straight from the bottle. The tone is unmistakably different. Angrier maybe, or more honest. A voice less concerned with romance and more with aftermath. And oh, the aftermath. He writes about the night they smashed a crystal ashtray during a fight about Virginia Woolf. About the argument in Antibes when Zelda accused him of copying Hemingway's tone. About a dress torn, deliberately, dramatically. because it reminded her of a party where he had flirted too long with another writer's wife. You don't get the sense he's proud of any of this, but he's not hiding from it either. That's the strange part. He documents it like a war reporter, weary and factual. You threw my Galignani's French dictionary into the sea, he writes. I clapped, I shouldn't have. You dove in after it, I shouldn't have let you. In every line, the alcohol lingers. Not mentioned directly, but seeping through. The slurred sentences, the rambling repetitions, the way he loops back to the same night 3 times like he's forgotten he already told it. Mainstream fact, Fitzgerald was a notorious drinker. Gin before lunch, cognac at dinner. Zelda once said being married to him was like living inside a jazz song at full volume. What few people know is that he sometimes used old manuscripts as coasters, literally. There are faint rings on these pages, coffee, or something stronger, preserved like sediment in a bottle. It's hard to tell when the letter ends and the memory begins. Somewhere in the middle, the writing blurs into a kind of half-dialogue. Zelda. You never love me when you're sober. Me, that's not true. Zelda, prove it. Me, I wrote Gatsby. Zelda, that's not about me. Me, isn't it? That last question isn't rhetorical. It's scratched in again, fainter, isn't it? You pause. Because that's the core of their tragedy, isn't it? That he gave the world one of the greatest American novels, saturated with longing, excess, and illusion, but in doing so, hollowed out their private world and filled it with ink. Historians still debate whether Zelda inspired Daisy Buchanan. Some say she's the blueprint. Others argue Daisy was a composite, part Zelda, part flapper archetype, part Scott's own unattainable ideal. But here in this unfiltered letter, he practically admits it. I wrote her because I couldn't bear to write you. You were too alive, too clever to pin down. You kept moving. It's not praise, it's surrender. And yet, just when the letter gets too heavy, just when you think you might close the page out of second-hand heartbreak, he drops a line that makes you chuckle. Also, we once tried to dance on the hotel piano and broke it. Tell me that's not the plot of a better novel. There it is, that glimmer of Fitzgerald charm, the ability to undercut tragedy with a wink, like he knew the only way to survive being himself was to laugh at it now and then. You flip to the bottom of the page. The last line is crooked, as if written while lying down. If you'd answered that night, I wouldn't have sent this. It's unclear which night he means. There were probably many. But somehow you don't need the specifics. The ache is universal. The text you don't send, the apology you rehearse out loud but never speak, the midnight confession left in the notes app of your soul. The ink here has bled slightly. Perhaps from tears, perhaps from spilled bourbon. Either way, you sit quietly for a moment, letting the ghosts settle around you, because this isn't just a love story. It's a cautionary tale with a beautiful soundtrack and no happy ending. Paris greets you on the next page, but not the postcard kind. No Eiffel Tower lit in sepia, no accordion music swelling behind lovers in berets. No, this is 1920s Paris scene from the inside out, through the haze of gin, the fog of typewriter smoke, and the roar of laughter that often came just before someone started crying. The letter starts in a loopy, almost playful tone. Do you remember the green velvet couch in Montparnasse? He doesn't wait for an answer. You said it made you feel like royalty and mildew all at once. It's a strange way to open a love letter, but then nothing about Fitzgerald and Zelda was ever tidy. They arrived in Paris with wild ambition and dwindling money. The world called them the golden couple of the lost generation, but you can already tell from these letters, they felt more lost than golden. The page unspools like a daydream tinted with regret. He describes afternoons in cafes where Zelda drew strangers without asking and Scott scrawled entire scenes on napkins. Dinners that stretched into midnight. Arguments over whether the French were secretly judging their grammar. They were, he writes. You were right, I still think about that waiter. The mainstream fact here is easy. The Fitzgeralds lived in Paris from 1924 to 1926, part of a glittering American expat circle that included Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and Ezra Pound. But what's not in the textbooks is the intimacy of this little world, how the artists both admired and secretly despised one another, how fame poisoned friendship, and how often laughter hid complete despair. Scott's letter veers into strange detail, describing a party thrown by a minor baron who had a pet monkey that wore a vest and hated Zelda on sight. You said it was because the monkey sensed I loved you more than you loved me. I said it was because you drank his brandy. You were probably right. That's the fringe tidbit you didn't know you needed. Zelda Fitzgerald versus a drunk monkey in Paris. But the humor turns brittle around the edges. He writes about a cold morning when they walked by the Seine in silence. You hadn't spoken to me in 2 days. I asked if you were tired. You said, no, just rearranging the plot of our life together. I laughed, but it wasn't funny. There's an open wound in those words, a sense that Paris was less a romantic backdrop and more a distraction, one that couldn't quite keep them from unraveling. He recalls being at a reading where Hemingway mocked his latest story, not cruelly, just carelessly. You said I should punch him. I wanted to, but instead I rewrote the ending again. That's the part historians still argue over. Did Paris refine Fitzgerald's voice or fracture it? Did he absorb brilliance or comparison? Was The Great Gatsby sharpened by this era, or diluted by it? What's clear from the letter is that, for Scott, Paris was not a creative haven. It was a mirror he kept trying to crack, hoping he wouldn't have to see himself clearly. Every street felt like a dare, he writes. Every night, a chance to vanish and be rewritten. There's a tenderness, too, underneath the ache. He describes one afternoon where they danced, alone, in a bookstore that smelled like old rain and binding glue. You said books made the best music. I didn't understand what you meant until after you stopped singing. The page ends with one quiet plea. I wish I had watched you more and written you less. You close the page like shutting a curtain. Not because you're done, but because the moment feels too fragile to linger in. This was their Paris, brilliant, bruised, and always slipping just out of reach. And you're still sitting there, a century later, catching every word like rain in your palms, wondering how something so specific could feel so eerily familiar. This page surprises you. The slant of the handwriting changes. The loops are wider, the ink lighter, and something in your chest tugs sharply because, for the first time, these aren't his words, they're hers. Pressed between two of Scott's increasingly messy entries is a single, folded page. Different paper, softer, pale lilac, faded now into gray, the kind of stationery that whispers of a time when letters were perfume-scented and secrets traveled in envelopes sealed with wax and trembling hope. You unfold it carefully, Scott. Not my love, not darling, just his name, followed by a pause long enough to be an accusation. What follows is a letter written not for nostalgia but clarity. It's deliberate, composed. A still lake, though you sense something thrashing just beneath the surface. You write the way you want things to be, she says early on, but I lived what they were. There is a difference, and I won't apologize for remembering it correctly. You sit back, this isn't a love letter. It's not even an apology. It's an answer, a rebuttal. Zelda, for so long mythologized as muse, flapper, and cautionary tale, is here real, vivid, and finally speaking for herself. The letter isn't long, but every sentence is razor-sharp. She talks about being turned into fiction, the way he painted her laugh into characters, twisted their worst nights into plot points. You wrote me into women with gold hair and paper bones. I was never that fragile. That fringe tidbit you never read in high school lit class. Zelda hated being seen as Daisy Buchanan. Daisy was a ghost, she once said aloud, according to a friend, and I was flesh. Here on this page, she refuses to be ethereal. She is angry. She is precise. And somehow she's still trying to reach him. There's a paragraph short, buried in the middle, that breaks the rhythm. I remember one night you read me a sentence you had just written. You were so proud of it. I pretended to like it because I wanted you to kiss me. Later, I realized it didn't make any sense, but I still remember how you looked when you read it aloud. It's tender and it's heartbreaking, because love, as she writes it here, wasn't just romance. It was silence, compromise, pretending. Historians still argue over Zelda's literary contributions. Her only novel, Save Me the Waltz, was dismissed in its time and later reconsidered as a raw masterpiece. Some claim Scott edited it mercilessly out of jealousy. Others say he was protecting their shared image. This letter doesn't answer the debate, but it makes one thing clear. Zelda was not just inspiration. She was a writer who knew her own mind. Near the end, her tone shifts. The sentences soften, like footsteps slowing on a creaky stair. I loved you. I still do, in that impossible way people love the things that made them and broke them all at once. And then at the bottom, almost like an afterthought, I kept the brooch. I knew the monkey hated it. You smile. It's a callback to Scott's letter, to that ridiculous night in Paris. It's funny and sharp and real. The kind of line that makes you believe, no matter how messy things became, they were once a perfect kind of ridiculous together. You flip the page hoping for more, but that's it. One letter. One voice held inside a manuscript he never published. Did he keep it hidden? Did he find it again and reread it in secret? Or did he bury it there like a message in a bottle, waiting for someone, maybe you, to find it someday and know that she had spoken back? The paper trembles slightly in your hand, not from the drafty room, but from the echo left behind. A woman forgotten by history, answering the myth in her own quiet script. This was never just his story, and now, finally, it isn't. The paper you turn to next is different, thicker, yellowed like old ivory. The ink is faint and stuttered, as if it had been written in poor light or with an unsteady hand. You can almost hear the silence around it, the kind that settles in hospital corridors and hangs over empty chairs in visiting rooms. It begins simply, Zelda, they won't let me see you this week. No dramatic flair, no metaphor, just loneliness, cracked and real. The letter appears to have been written during one of Zelda's hospital stays, likely in the late 1930s when her schizophrenia had deepened and she was moved between clinics. By then, their correspondence had grown inconsistent, erratic, but this letter, this one is steady, deliberate, like a man determined to be gentle even as the world buckles under him. He describes the air outside her window, even though he's not sure if she can see it. The magnolias have started blooming again, same time as always. I pretend they're blooming for you. It's a small line, almost cliché. But when you know he's sitting alone, outside a sanitarium, writing to a woman whose mind may no longer recognize him, it lands differently. Historians often skip over this period. It's not glamorous, no grand novels. No wild parties, just Scott living in motels, writing forgotten screenplays and sending letters into the void. He was broke, he was sick, and he was still unbelievably in love. There's a soft desperation in his voice here. Not the flamboyant yearning of earlier letters. This is quieter, resigned. He doesn't plead for her to get better. He doesn't describe his grief in sweeping prose. He just talks about the days. I bought a new pen, it leaks. You'd hate it. And later, I saw a dog that looked like the one we met in Antibes. I tried to pet it. It bit me. You laugh a little. Even here in this bleak moment, he can't help slipping in something absurd. A man bitten by nostalgia, literally. But then the letter tilts. His voice grows distant. I dreamed of you again last night, he writes. We were standing on the balcony of that awful pink hotel in Nice. You asked me to jump with you. I said I couldn't. You jumped anyway. But you floated. There's something surreal about it. Was it a dream, a metaphor, a memory blurred by years and bourbon? Hard to say, and that's the point. By this time in his life, memory and fantasy often danced in the same clothes. The fringe detail here. Fitzgerald was briefly hospitalized himself in 1939 for alcoholism and what doctors at the time vaguely labeled nervous exhaustion. He downplayed it, of course. Called it a slight interruption, but reading this letter, you feel that he was crumbling too, just more quietly. He ends the page with a single line, centered and careful. If you don't know who I am anymore, that's all right. I still know you. That line sits in your chest like a stone wrapped in velvet. It's not meant to be romantic. It's not even hopeful. It's just accepting. Historians still argue whether Zelda ever read these late letters. Some say her condition deteriorated too far. Others claim she kept them hidden like secrets. Maybe both are true. You fold the page back gently, mindful of the silence it came from. This wasn't written for performance. Not for posterity. It's the sound of someone keeping love alive, not with fire, but with breath. And you realize, in the stillness of that moment, that the loudest love stories aren't always the ones that make it into books. Sometimes they're scrawled in a trembling hand, addressed to someone who may never read them, and left behind like a whisper in an empty room. The next page feels different again, riddled with symbols, question marks, and phrases that loop like vines over the margins. It's not chaos exactly, but it's definitely the kind of writing done when the line between poetry and exhaustion has completely dissolved. At the top, a title of sorts, for the lady of the peach-light halo. And beneath it, or how to build a memory that won't drown. You pause. This doesn't sound like a letter or a story. It feels more like an incantation or a hallucination dressed in metaphor. The text that follows is a swirl of cryptic images and coded affection. Your eyes were the color of Hemingway's worst idea, he writes, and your hair smelled like unsent telegrams. It's romantic, it's ridiculous. It's unmistakably Fitzgerald in full flourish, but it also feels like he's trying to hide something. You start noticing a pattern, initials scattered through the text, Z, E, sometimes a stylized S, all dancing in and out of what might be actual sentences. There's even a paragraph written entirely in rhyme, ending with, I kept your voice in a porcelain cup, but now it leaks and won't fill up. It's clever, yes, but what does it mean? Historians still argue whether Fitzgerald used personal codes in his manuscripts, especially later in life. Some believe he embedded veiled references to Zelda throughout his work, marking them with shared metaphors only she would recognize. Others think the complexity of his language in decline was less about secrecy and more about a mind fragmenting under pressure. There's even a fringe theory, rarely taken seriously in academic circles, that Fitzgerald used a simple cipher when he felt he couldn't say things directly. A kind of encryption of the heart, romantic nonsense probably, but still. You read further and find something that supports the theory. You were never the green light, Zelda. You were the river, the part Gatsby couldn't cross. A deliberate echo from the Great Gatsby, but here he rewrites his own myth. The green light, the symbol of unreachable desire, wasn't her after all. She wasn't the dream. She was the thing that made him dream. And maybe the thing that made him drown in it. There's a sentence midway through that makes your brow furrow. If you find this, decode it. If you can't, laugh anyway. It's inscribed sideways along the inner margin. You can imagine him smirking as he wrote it, the kind of smirk someone gives when they're not sure whether they're brilliant or broken. Maybe both. You pick out a few more strange comparisons. Your kiss was a deadline I missed by weeks. You walked like a confession nobody wanted to hear. We made love like architects, every angle, no support. It's dramatic, overwrought, and it's exactly the kind of language a man uses when he wants to feel something but can't say it plainly. You wonder if Zelda ever read this one, and if she did, whether she rolled her eyes or cried, or maybe both. She once said, Scott always hid behind language. Even when he was telling the truth, he used metaphors like shields. This page feels like a fortress made of those shields, illusions layered upon illusions, as if peeling them back would expose too much. But you try anyway, because beneath the swirling imagery, there is grief. He writes of a woman who is both muse and ghost, both mirror and wound, and he's reaching for her, not with open arms, but with riddles, as if she might come back if the poetry was just right. The last line is a single word, circled 3 times, still. Still what? Still in love, still waiting, still writing, still broken, you're not sure, but it lingers, as if the page itself refuses to finish the sentence. The next page isn't labeled, but it begins mid-thought, mid-confession, like a voice slipping through a crack in the night. I don't know if you still read these. Maybe you don't, maybe someone else does, but I keep writing. Already you feel the weight. It's not performative now. It's not poetic. It's just quiet, weary, the kind of tone you hear when someone talks more to themselves than to anyone else. He doesn't say her name, doesn't need to. The entire page pulses with her shadow. He recounts a memory that's as tender as it is unremarkable, Zelda humming over the sound of a hotel radiator while brushing her teeth. I told you it was off-key. You threw the toothbrush at me. I dodged, you smirked. It was Tuesday. That's the kind of love story no one prints, but the kind people mourn the longest. Then comes the line that changes the rhythm. There's something I never told you. You hold your breath as if you're there in the room with him, waiting. I burned your first letter, not out of anger or spite, but because it made me feel too much. I wasn't strong enough to keep that kind of honesty in the drawer. The ink here is a little darker, as if pressed harder. You can almost hear the quiver in his pen. The confession isn't cinematic. There's no punchline. It's just a small, quiet failure, and somehow that makes it worse. He goes on to describe the letter, what he remembers of it. Zelda had written it on train stationery, addressed it in tiny looping script, and signed off with a phrase she never used anywhere else. Don't be too noble to be kind. He repeats the line twice, then once more at the bottom of the paragraph, like it won't let him go. Mainstream biographers often portray Scott as a man drowning in his own legend, but letters like this reveal something more fragile. Not just regret, but the knowledge that some things can't be rewritten, no matter how good the prose. I think I loved you best when you weren't looking at me, he writes. When your eyes were on the book, or the sky, or someone else at the party, you were freer then, and I hated that. That admission is raw, not romantic, not noble, just honest. And honesty, by this point in the manuscript, feels like its own kind of gift. There's a fringe theory, barely footnoted in academic texts, that Scott believed he would die young because he'd already given his best self away. Some say he told friends he'd used it all up by 35. Reading this letter, you start to believe he meant it, and yet, even in this slow unraveling, he finds room for humor. Remember when we tried to bake a pie and forgot the sugar? You said it tasted like despair with crust. I published a short story 3 months later and called it The Bitter Fruit. No one caught the joke, except you. You laugh. It's so specifically domestic, so casually tragic, that it lands somewhere between a sitcom and an obituary. The way love lives in failure, in inside jokes, in things nobody else understands. Near the end, his sentences shorten. Almost afraid to go on. I don't expect an answer. I don't know if you're even there, but I'll leave this here anyway. It reads like a voicemail on an old tape, like something played over and over again, not because it changes, but because it doesn't. The final line is half-finished, trailing off mid-word. I miss you when I remember. That's it. No punctuation, no closure. You stare at it for a long time, not because you expect more, but because you're not sure what to do with what's there. There's something holy about it, this kind of unfinished grief. A man speaking into the dark, hoping memory is strong enough to act as echo. And now that you've read it, maybe it is. The next set of pages, clipped together with a rusted paperclip, feels more like a crime scene than correspondence. The title at the top of the first page reads, Original Ending, The Icehouse Dialogues. There's a line through the title, a thick one, red pencil, editorial, probably not his. You glance at the pages beneath and realize quickly. These weren't love letters, not exactly. They were scenes, dialogue, fictional technically, but bleeding so hard from real memory that they might as well be diary entries in costume. The characters are unnamed, but the voices are unmistakable. A woman with sharp wit, prone to unpredictable laughter. A man exhausted by his own mind, desperate to say something true but only able to speak in metaphors. It's Fitzgerald and Zelda, barely disguised. The scene unfolds in an abandoned icehouse, a symbolic choice, surely, and it reads like the final conversation of a couple who know they won't be couples much longer. It's not dramatic, it's quiet. Every word lands like a step across thin ice. You always edit the truth, she says at one point. I revise it, he replies. To what? To something beautiful. Then it isn't true. Maybe not, but it hurts less that way. You pause, there it is again, his lifelong war between beauty and honesty. It played out in every draft, every letter, every Gatsby party where he made grief look like glitter. This cut scene isn't polished. The formatting is odd. There are multiple crossed-out lines, rewritten phrases, ink blots. But in its imperfections, it feels more honest than anything you've read so far. There's a paragraph where the female character sits on a pile of melting ice and asks him why he keeps writing love stories when he's clearly not very good at loving. His reply, because I keep hoping that if I can write it right, it'll happen backward. It's absurd, beautiful, painfully revealing, and completely human. Historians still debate the reason these pages were cut. Some believe Fitzgerald's editor found them too indulgent. Others think he removed them himself, afraid they'd be recognized for what they really were, a confession disguised as fiction. Either way, they were lost to readers, until now. There's a margin note in his own hand, written later, perhaps during one of his many revision spirals. It says, "Too personal, try again with strangers." That line hits like a slap, because what you're holding isn't a failed draft. It's a buried truth, a version of himself he didn't think readers could handle, or maybe didn't want Zelda to see. At the end of the scene, the characters sit in silence. She hums, he watches the ceiling leak, and then she. "Do you still love me?" He's not in a publishable way. It's too sharp to be fiction, it's not metaphor. It's the kind of line people say when they're too tired to lie. There's one last page added later, short, 4 lines. Editor said this scene drags. He's right, so does love, cut it anyway. You place the pages down slowly, feeling the cold of that fictional icehouse settle into your fingertips. This wasn't just storytelling. It was a man whispering truths into characters because he didn't have the nerve to say them aloud. And now you've read them, these raw, hidden scraps stitched into the edges of his brilliance. You wonder how many more truths were buried in metaphor, how many apologies were masked as edits. Fitzgerald may have cut the scene, but you're here now, and the truth, belated as it is, breathes again. The next page is fragile, not metaphorically, literally. The paper is thinner, more brittle. A fold line cuts it into thirds like it had once been prepared for an envelope, but it was never sent. You can feel that. There's no address, no postage, just a name in the top corner, Zelda. There's something sacred about it, something final. Before you even read the first line, you know this is the last one. It begins without flourish. I've rewritten this a dozen times, but I think this version is the closest to the truth. Immediately, the tone feels different from the earlier letters. Less performance, no frilly metaphors, no romantic self-destruction. This is the voice of a man who knows the story is almost over. "I can't undo what I did with my writing," he says. "You were too alive to be captured in ink and too sharp to be flattened onto a page. But I kept trying, didn't I? I tried until you disappeared behind the sentences." It's clear he's reflecting now, not yearning. The voice is almost paternal, not in authority, but in quiet protectiveness. He's no longer writing to win her back or make her remember. He's writing to let her go. He mentions that he saw her photograph recently in a magazine article, one about the jazz age. "They called you a tragic muse." I laughed. "You would have set the paper on fire for that." It's a fringe moment of history, true and barely documented, that Zelda's face was used in a 1939 spread about the lost generation. No caption, just a smile from a party long faded. Scott, broke and nearly forgotten in Hollywood, would have seen it by accident, and clearly, it hit him like a ghost tapping on the shoulder. "I keep wondering what would have happened if we had stayed unknown," he writes. "No books, no fame. Just peach trees in Montgomery and a front porch with no audience." Historians still argue whether their fame destroyed their marriage or if the destruction was simply more visible because of it. In this letter, Scott doesn't pick a side. He just describes what was: sleepless nights, unchecked ambition, and two people who kept setting fires and calling them warmth. There's a part near the middle where his sentences break down. Fragments, clauses that never finish. The pen pressure changes, too lighter, uneven. It's as if his hand can't quite keep up with the emotion. "You had the better words, I think," he says. "Even when they said you were losing your mind, your sentences had teeth. Mine just had rhythm." That line stays with you because it's an admission no one asked for and no one expected. He tries, near the end, to recall their first kiss. "I want to tell you it was in the rain or under magnolia trees, something Fitzgeraldian," he jokes. "But I think it was in a car that smelled like gasoline and laughter. You bit my lip. I tasted blood and citrus, and I thought, this is it." You can almost see them, young, volatile, electric. Before the publishers, before the parties, before the hospitals. Just two people too big for the world they were born into. The letter ends quietly. "If you ever read this, know that I didn't mean to love you into fiction. I just didn't know how to love you any other way." No signature, just white space beneath, a deliberate silence. You stare at the page, unsure what to feel. It's not an apology, it's not a goodbye, it's something heavier. The weight of a man trying to make peace with a life lived too loudly, and a love that burned through every word he ever wrote. As you fold the page closed, carefully, you realize you've reached the soft center of something brutal. The heart not of a legend, but of a man who kept writing because he couldn't speak the truth out loud. This letter wasn't mailed, but now it's been read, and maybe, just maybe, that was always the point. By now, the distinction between the man and the manuscript is barely visible. The next set of pages, more polished, more conventional, appears at first to be excerpts from a story. But as your eyes trace the lines, you begin to recognize the undercurrent. These aren't characters speaking. It's Scott, again, using fiction as a mask to whisper to Zelda across decades. This short story draft is untitled, half-complete, and riddled with edits. It features a woman named Clara and a man named Vincent. They are, of course, not real. But Vincent plays the piano with clenched teeth and drinks gin from a teacup, and Clara has a laugh described as familiar to those who have ever been adored into silence. You've read enough by now to know exactly who they are. The dialogue isn't subtle. Clara tells Vincent, "You want me to sparkle for your readers, but never burn too hot for you." And he responds, "I only write what I'm afraid to feel." It's not even fiction anymore. It's confession with a plot. What makes it more haunting is how certain phrases echo lines from The Great Gatsby and Tender is the Night. Sentences lifted and reworded, like he's been recycling their relationship through his work over and over, trying to get it right. Trying to say what he couldn't in person. Mainstream fact. Critics have long speculated that many of Fitzgerald's heroines, Daisy, Nicole, even the side characters, were reflections of Zelda. But here in this draft, there's no speculation. It's direct. Vincent writes letters he never sends. Clara walks out of scenes midline, and every metaphor bends toward regret. There's a paragraph that stands out. He painted her into every party, every empty ballroom, every warm afternoon, not because she stayed, but because memory was the only place she never left. You sit with that line. That's not about character development. That's about a man learning to build shrines in his paragraphs because the real altar crumbled years ago. There's a quirky detail that makes you smile, one of those odd little echoes that feels too strange to be invented. Vincent describes Clara cooking eggs with a ridiculous copper ladle shaped like a swan, which, it turns out, was a real item Zelda once wrote about in a shopping list she sent Scott during their happier years. Scholars ignored it. But here it is again, nestled inside a sentence like a secret note. It makes you wonder how many of these artifacts, those invisible threads between life and literature, exist in plain sight, buried in fiction. Historians still argue. Was Fitzgerald exploiting Zelda's madness for art or preserving her? Did he glorify her or steal her voice? Did he try to save her with his stories, or just save himself? This half-finished piece seems to hold its own answer. He wanted her remembered, not understood, because understanding meant admitting he broke her in the remembering. You don't know if this line was meant for anyone else, maybe not even for Zelda. Maybe this was the one story he never planned to finish, because finishing it would make it real. The last sentence is incomplete, a trailing clause, and when she finally left the room. Then nothing, just white space. It feels fitting. The page itself becomes the silence he never filled. You close it softly, like folding the edge of a dream. Fitzgerald didn't just love Zelda. He wrote her into the world over and over, until she became part of the very language he used to mourn her. And now you've heard her in the margins, too. At this point, the manuscript has transformed into something else entirely. Not a story, not a collection of letters, more like a slow-burning investigation into love, art, and the blurred no-man's land between them. The next page, tucked deep near the back, isn't personal at all. No Zelda, no confessions, just questions, posed like notes to self or arguments overheard in some smoky seminar room. At the top, underlined twice. What if I imagined her wrong? That question hangs there, thick with implication. You can almost hear him pacing. What follows is a string of musings, not poetic, not even especially literary. More like a man confronting his own mythology and realizing the bricks don't quite hold anymore. They see her as fragile, so I made her sharp. They saw her as wild, so I gave her stillness. They see her as tragic. I tried so many times to make her inevitable instead. You feel the tide shifting. This is no longer a man writing to a woman. This is a man writing to history, or perhaps trying to bargain with it. He lists facts almost defensively. She was published first. She taught me how to speak in paradox. She saw Hemingway's ego before I did. She danced barefoot in hotel lobbies and quoted Ibsen after midnight. You recognize these as defenses, pleased to remember that Zelda was more than just muse, flapper, or institutional patient. She was a creator, a fighter, and in her own way, a writer of their shared story. But then comes the pivot, a note scrawled in the margin as if interrupting himself, but I wrote her too big to live beside. That line stings because it's true. Every story he wrote featuring a Zelda-like figure became larger than life, more enchanting, more mysterious, more doomed. The kind of woman no one could actually survive being. Historians still debate this exact point. Was Fitzgerald's depiction of Zelda a form of literary love or erasure? Did his romanticism preserve her memory or overwrite it with a prettier version? The scholarly camps remain divided, and Scott seems to know that. He even quotes one of his critics, someone from a magazine who once wrote, "Fitzgerald made his wife into fiction and lost her in the edit." He crosses it out, then writes beneath it, "Or maybe I lost her in the first paragraph." There's a note farther down the page, almost hidden in the crease of the fold. If love is real, it should outlast the last draft. If it doesn't, maybe it wasn't love, or maybe I'm just a better editor than partner. You can't help but smile at the brutal self-awareness. It's so Fitzgerald, melancholic, self-effacing, clever, and hollow in all the right places. Then comes a bizarre aside. Someone will study this someday, someone with better lighting and less gin. They'll ask if I meant to write her out or write her down. They'll miss the real question. Did she know I couldn't help it? That's what this page feels like, a tangled mess of self-defense, self-reproach, and the kind of fragile honesty that only surfaces when there's no one left to answer back. At the bottom of the page, the final note. She outlived me in every way that matters, even when she didn't. You sit with that for a long time, because Zelda died 7 years after Scott, in a tragic fire at the hospital where she was staying. And yet in these pages, in these questions, she's the one still alive, still resisting, still rewriting the story in your hands. This isn't just literature. It's a relationship exhumed by paper and ink, and the questions he leaves behind. They're no longer his alone. Now they're yours too. You don't expect what comes next. The paper is heavier again, creamy, almost ceremonial. The handwriting is slow, careful, as if written by someone finally trying to steady a hand that had shaken too long. It begins without a salutation. No Zelda, no my dear, just a plain sentence, I survived you. You stop, it's not a boast, not a victory, just a plain truth delivered like a sigh. He means it literally. Zelda died in March 1948, trapped in a fire at Highland Hospital. Scott had been gone 8 years by then, dying of a heart attack in 1940. But in this letter, time folds like a handkerchief. I didn't think you would go first, he writes. You always had the last word. I assumed you'd save it for me. It's the first time he writes to her as someone already gone. The tone is strange, gentle, but not dreamy. It's as if the page is less a letter and more a eulogy for both of them. He doesn't romanticize her death. He doesn't cry on the page. He just recounts. They said it was quick. They said you didn't suffer. They said a lot of things to make it sound better. But I know you. You hated flames. You remember reading somewhere that Zelda had been locked in her room that night. The details were fuzzy. Tragic fires rarely leave clean explanations. Historians still debate whether she was sedated or whether she knew. Whether she was writing, sleeping, pacing. Scott doesn't guess here. He just mourns in silence. He moves on to smaller things, mentions the way her handwriting slanted up when she was excited, how she once fell asleep in a museum in Rome and refused to apologize. You said the sculpture bored you into serenity. Then comes a strange paragraph. If ghosts exist, I hope you've found somewhere quieter. No typewriters, no parties, no deadlines, just a lake, a book, and a place to float. It's not flowery, it's not overwrought. It feels like the kind of thing you say when you don't believe in much anymore, but still hope there's peace somewhere for someone you couldn't give it to yourself. He admits things he never did earlier in the manuscript. I stole from you. Your jokes, your metaphors, your boldness. I buried them in men with fake names and too many cocktails. And then I gave you to the world, but not gently. That line feels like the thesis of everything you've read. Not just a confession of love, but of damage, of how art can preserve someone while also reducing them, of how a woman became a symbol before she had a chance to be understood. There's a softer note here, too, something like reverence. You were more than the girl in white, more than the scandal, more than Daisy or Nicole or any of them. You were a hurricane in a jazz rhythm, a girl with brass knuckles made of laughter. Then a final phrase, unexpected and odd and perfect. If I meet you again, I hope I've learned to shut up long enough to listen. No signature, no postscript, just that one last wish. You turn the page, but it's blank. He left it that way either on purpose or because he knew there was nothing left to say. This wasn't just the end of a love story. It was the echo after the end, the hum of what's left behind when the orchestra stops. A man writing to a memory he built and broke, and somehow you reading it all, becoming part of the final punctuation. You fold the page and sit in the stillness, wondering not just what he lost, but what he was trying to hold on to, even long after the story was supposed to be over. You've reached the final pages now, and your hands move slower, not out of caution, but reverence. There's a feeling that what comes next isn't part of the manuscript so much as an epilogue, one written in a whisper. The page begins without introduction, a single line centered near the top. The green light wasn't for Gatsby. That's all it says. You blink. It's a quiet bombshell, simple but profound, and somehow it makes perfect sense. For decades, scholars have pored over the green light at the end of The Great Gatsby, symbol of hope, longing, the American dream, etc., etc. But here, on this final page, Fitzgerald reclaims it. Not for literary analysis, but for her. The paragraph below unfolds like a secret finally exhaled. They thought I wrote the green light for ambition. They thought I wrote it for nostalgia. But I wrote it because you told me once. Every time I leave a room, I look back, just in case. You close your eyes for a moment, because now the light isn't abstract. It's not about chasing dreams. It's about looking back. Hoping someone somewhere is still watching. He continues, the green light was the porch lamp, the one I imagined you might leave on, not for me to find you, but to know you were still there. There's no need to decode this. It's clear. Zelda was never just his muse. She was the ache behind every metaphor, the ghost between every line. He refers once more to their early days, before publication, before New York, before the world noticed. We were better before the applause, he writes. Quieter, hungrier, braver. I miss that girl who kissed me behind a theater and then ran away laughing. That moment isn't in any novel, but maybe it should have been. Then comes the only drawing in the entire manuscript, sketched in pencil, faint and smudged, a little house by a lake, a figure on the porch with one arm raised in what might be a wave or a farewell below it. If you come back, even as smoke, even as light, I'll leave the door unlocked. Historians still argue whether Fitzgerald had a final project in mind when he died. Some say he was working on the last tycoon with hopeful energy. Others suggest he'd grown disillusioned, but these pages suggest something quieter, that he was still writing her even then, not for the world, just for her, always for her. The very last sentence is centered at the bottom of the page. No flourish, no punctuation, just still here. You stare at it, letting it settle. You imagine it not as a statement of presence, but of devotion. A whisper sent into the dark, not to be answered, only felt. You close the final page. The manuscript doesn't creak or cry out. It just rests. After all these years, all these words, it finally lies still. You exhale, not because the story is over, but because some stories aren't meant to end. They're meant to echo, and now, as the quiet wraps around you like a second blanket, you realize this wasn't just a forgotten draft. It was a love letter misfiled as literature, a grief disguised as genius. A man trying to prove that some flames don't go out, they just change shape. And now, the pages rest. The manuscript is closed. The ink no longer smudges beneath your fingertips. The ghosts, his voice, her laughter, their tangled sentences, fade softly into the hush of the room around you. You're no longer holding a story. You're You're holding an echo, a soft one that pulses like a heartbeat just beneath sleep. Let it be quiet now. You've walked through the wreckage of love and language. You've felt what it means to grieve in metaphor, to long through margins, to write not because someone will read it, but because maybe, just maybe, they'll feel it. The room feels slower, softer, like memory itself has dimmed the lamps and pulled up a chair beside you, and that's okay. Let your breath steady, let your limbs grow heavier. There is nothing left to solve, nothing to search for. Just the hum of pages turned and hearts spoken across decades. Think, if you like, of the green light, not as a symbol, but a warm glow from a front porch somewhere far away. A light someone leaves on, just in case you find your way back. And maybe you do, maybe in dreams, or maybe you're already there. So rest now. The story isn't going anywhere. The ink has dried, the letters are sealed, and the night is ready to take you gently into whatever comes next. You're safe here, between memory and quiet, still here, always here.